Welcome, everybody, to the Truthful Hope podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vazquez, and I want to start this episode with providing or offering three questions. One, can we know the past? Two, how do we know the past? And then three, can historians investigate divine action or miracles? And then how does this relate to our understanding of the resurrection of Jesus? I'm excited to have join me on today's show someone who can really help answer these questions and has dug deep into seeking these answers. And that is President of Core Apologetics and Adjunct Professor at Liberty, Dr. Ben Shaw. Ben, thank you so much for jumping on.
Hey, Jacob, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. Really excited to talk about this subject, which, these three roadblocks aren't typically things I get to discuss as much as I do the actual data surrounding the resurrection and things like that. So looking forward to this.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a great topic. And just for our listeners, you have a list of accolades that I want to just share with them so they know who they're listening to. You have a Master's of Arts and Religious Studies and a PhD in Theology and Apologetics from Liberty. And then, as I mentioned, you're the president of Core Apologetics and an adjunct professor at Liberty. But what I found really interesting is that you're a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I am also a black belt in karate. Please don't ask me which form because I'm not going to remember. Got it when I was like 15. But I just thought that was a cool little add-on to your list of accolades there. But before we
Yeah.
get into, so if you want to address the black belt thing.
Yeah, I'm just trying to stay in shape because, people see the black belt, but it's like, man, I'm getting older and trying to maintain staying in shape is the challenge. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I still try to train at least once a week if I can.
That's awesome. So for our listeners, don't mess with him in a debate and don't mess with him physically. Is that what you're trying to is that what you're trying to give off? But nevertheless, before we get going, do you want to just shed light on what Core Apologetics is all about? What are you guys doing over there, and what's your mission at that ministry?
Yeah, Core is a really neat ministry, and it originally started as a doubters ministry, and it was founded by a gentleman named Ron Davis. And uh, as Dr. Habermas, if you're not familiar with him, he's the world's leading expert on Jesus' resurrection. And as he began working on his magnum opus, which is 4-volume series on Jesus' resurrection, with each volume being about 1,000 pages each, roughly. It's a big project, takes a lot of time. And so when he started doing that, Dr. Habermas would often speak to doubters and people with questions. And as he started working on this MO, he couldn't talk to doubters and complete the MO. So he had to pick one. And so he's like, well, let me finish the MO because that can outlast me. And in one of his classes, he goes, hey, I need someone to help talk to some of my doubters. Can someone want to help me with that? And Ron put his hand up. He's like, yeah, I'd love to be one of those guys. So he got vetted, and then Dr. Habermas started sending him some doubters. Long story short, Ron's talked to about 1,500 doubters in the past several years. So a number of different doubters. He did his dissertation on the subject, and that's how I got involved. I was on Ron's dissertation committee, and we were just talking about ministry and things like that. And one day he's like, I got a crazy idea, Ben. Why don't you partner with me at Core Apologetics? And we could do a lot more than dealing with doubt. And so I was like, okay, that sounds great. Let's do this. And so now our ministry, it certainly uses apologetics to help minister to those who are doubting, but we're also trying to help equip disciples with these core truths of Christianity. We're not trying to talk about secondary or tertiary topics, but what are the main things, and trying to keep the main thing the main thing. Because as you probably know, and as some studies show, Christians have a hard time majoring on the majors. And so
Mm.
let's start with the fundamentals first before we worry about these other issues. So did Jesus rise from the dead? I don't know. That sounds like it's something as of first importance that Paul might say. So that's one area. Reliability of the New Testament, dealing with doubts and questions. How do we address them? And then, what about other worldviews, discipleship? What's the gospel? What's it mean to be a disciple? Things like that. And so that's what we're doing. We kind of joke it takes two of us to do what Habermas has done. And so, and really, we're only doing half of what he's done because he's done stuff with the shroud and all kinds of other things. So, um, but that's what our ministry is geared on. We're trying to help take these things that people learn in seminary at whether it's at the master's level or the PhD level, and bring it into churches, because I felt like I had to get a master's degree or a PhD to get my questions answered, when it really should be happening at the local church level. Uh, because again, if these are the fundamental truths, these are what we all need.
Right.
And it's not just those with PhDs. And we don't want to just go, oh, well, the pastor, go ask him your questions. I don't have to know anything. Like, oh, that's not right either. So
Mm.
trying to help address those sorts of things, whether it's with a church or Christian organization. And we do it in a bunch of different ways. We do events. One of the best things, at least in my opinion, that we do is webinars that are taught live. So, if you take a class online, I've taught online, I've taken classes online, and we all love discussion boards, right? They're very normal conversation, right?
Yeah.
No, they're just terribly awkward.
Yeah. I agree with you on this, this, and this, and this. That's
Yeah,
it.
yeah, and maybe someone reads a reply. I don't know if they do
Yeah.
or not. But we do everything live because if you got a question you want to ask it, well, that's what you can do in a live class. And so that's and they're only 6 weeks long, so it's 6 1-hour sessions, and they're recorded. So if you're missing, you're traveling, or you're busy because I don't know, maybe you're getting a master's degree, you work in science, and you're starting a ministry, and you're like, oh, oh, you got a child, okay, yeah, lots of things going on.
Yeah.
Well,
Sounds
this,
like a busy guy.
yeah, that sounds definitely a busy guy right there. So how do we help? How do we help equip people? Because everybody's busy,
Right.
and so we thought this would be a really great way to do that. And so asking questions, that's part of the jujitsu coming in, because
Mm.
it's hard to watch. Like, you can't get a black belt if you just watch YouTube videos. It's not going to happen. You, at some point, you're going to have to practice with somebody, even if they're friends and they're willing opponent. You still have to grab somebody and get a roll in. And I played hockey too. Yeah, same thing. I got to put skates on at some point. So at least this live discussion is some of those starting steps for that.
So good, and I think it's so needed because and we've talked about this in our podcast before, but Barna research found recently that only 4% of US adults who profess to be Christian have a biblical worldview. And to me that's just shocking. But then I looked at the other stat he came out with, and it's that only 37% of pastors have a biblical worldview. And it's, to your point, it's like they're coming with these questions. It doesn't seem like most of these pastors are equipped to answer them, and it's just the implication is being seen in the flock,
Oh
which
yeah,
is just really bad.
yeah. And there's a lot of challenges. I think in that same Barna study, um, the next generation, that was something we talked about before. The next generation, I think it's only less than 1% is on track to have a biblical worldview. And you're like, oh,
Wow.
this isn't good. So how do we help equip not just everyday believers, but leaders in the church, whether it's a youth pastor or a bivocational pastor or something like that? How do we help equip them? And again, these are some of the things we're trying to do, and we've had good feedback so far. It's really new. I mean, we're the only people doing a live interaction. Um, so I think that's part of building fellowship with one another, and all those sorts of things. And then you could see, hey, look, it's not, you're not the only one having that question. And my
Mm,
background, when I went to Liberty, I didn't know, like, Paul wrote half the New Testament. So like I didn't know anything about any, like, I just had a lot of questions.
mm,
And so I know other people have them too. How did Matthew, Mark, Luke, who picked those four? Why did we just have these four? And who is Mark? Who's Corinth? And I hear about Corinthian. Who's this guy? And you're like, oh,
right.
the city.
Yeah. Who's Corinth?
Yeah. So you start,
That's funny.
and those are just, you know, anyway. So yeah, that's what we're trying to help do, help encourage and equip. And I love that stuff because I do know, I still remember the feeling I had coming to Liberty, where I wanted to learn more, but didn't even know people took this stuff seriously.
That's so good. And, I think this topic in particular, because, you've written multiple books and you've participated in, like you said, the Gary Habermas big project on the resurrection. I think one of your most recent books, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Trustworthy 13 Arguments for the Reliability of the New Testament as of July of 2024, which
Yep.
in itself is a great topic to go through. But I came across your dissertation and I couldn't help myself by being super excited because, and it's titled, by the way, for our listeners, Philosophy of History, Historical Jesus Studies, and Miracles, Three Roadblocks to Resurrection Research. And namely, you sought to answer the questions that I kicked off this episode with. And I just think it's so important because so many times I see skeptics, whether it's on my TikTok account in the comment section or in person with family members and friends, they reject the resurrection not really on evidential basis. I could present them with that, but they're still skeptical. It's mainly like an a priori objection. They're already saying it's false based on their presuppositions, and you do at length do a great job of addressing those presuppositions. So I'm really excited to dive into that. But before we get into those three questions, maybe just unpack for us what motivated you to go into this topic in particular.
Yeah, well, so I did my master's thesis on the resurrection as well. So I was interested in this. By the way, I first met Dr. Gary Habermas as the hockey coach at Liberty. And the
Oh,
hockey team was the only reason I went to Liberty in the first place. So I met him, and then I read this book called The Case for the Resurrection. And I'm like, why is the hockey coach writing a book on the resurrection? And then, I came to find out, oh, he's a little more than a hockey coach. Okay.
yeah.
Um, and then, so as I was doing my Master Arts in Religious Studies, so I'm from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and Broward County is a huge county, millions of people, and so it's a million different worldviews. So I was always wrestling, like, okay, well, how do I know they're right, or how do I know they're wrong? Because how do I know I'm right and I'm wrong? I really don't have anything I feel like I'm solid on. Um, I kind of had a Peter in the sense in John where he's like, where else are we going to turn, Lord? Your words have eternal life. I kind of had that
Mm,
grasp. Um, and I didn't really see anyone else doing anything of wisdom, or even trying to. It was more just in the moment stuff. So I did wrestle with that. I just knew there were different worldviews. It's a pluralistic culture. So how do we discern those things? So that's why I was doing a Master Arts in Religious Studies, because I wanted to understand these different worldviews. The resurrection was something that stood out, and then I kept having questions, and then did that in the dissertation through my PhD studies. But then at the same time, Habermas, who's studied the resurrection longer than I've been alive, he 50 years plus, because he started when he was like a teenager. So
wow.
he's crazy. Um, so he started when he was a teenager, and he's writing 4 volumes on the resurrection. What in the world am I going to write that he has not already covered or will cover? And I was like, oh my goodness. That's how Trustworthy came about, because we were both speaking at an event. And I'm like, everything I know in the resurrection, he's basically taught me. What can I do that's going to be different? And
Yeah.
if he's there and I'm there, you don't want to hear me talk. Like, I wouldn't want to hear me talk. I'm gonna go hear what he's got to say. So that's how that reliability book came out. And then I just thought on these 3 areas, especially because volume 1, the evidential volume, that was the main one we were working on uh, when I was going through my dissertation. So I was like, okay, these are the issues that we often see that are kind of, like you said, below the surface. Like, okay, we'll talk about the data, but then there's some other things that may keep me from engaging the data properly, or the a priori's, for example. I'm sure we'll talk about miracles. And can a
Hmm.
historian say a miracle happen? Can miracles happen, period? Like, those are all questions that, I mean, they're very significant to this. So, and they apply to other fields. It's not like it's just unique with Christianity. If I've got certain a priori's with economic theory, and I'm studying the world right now as as things are quite chaotic, we might say. But even if I were to study um, another period in time, those issues are still going to be there, and we may talk about that. So I don't want to
Right.
tip
No.
tip tip the hand too early here.
No, that's great. I find that really interesting, and I recommend our listeners go check out "On the Resurrection" by Dr. Gary Habermas, and Dr. Shaw did a lot of work on that as well. It's the first volume is, I think it's called "On the
Yep.
Evidences," right?
It's just called
And
evidences. Yep.
evidences, yep. And I have it in my bookshelf. And I told you this before the recording, but anytime someone says, I don't think there's evidence for the resurrection, I feel like all I have to do is just give them this book of 1,000 pages and say, here, here's something to consider.
And the
Um,
second volume it's a little bit shorter. It's only like 900 pages on responses to alternative theories.
yep. It's
So
so good. It's just such a great job. And, I think paired with your dissertation, it kind of gives a full scope into the resurrection of Jesus, which is just incredible work. So let's just dive right into that first question, because it's that you pose and it's, can we know past events? And you pose it in this way from your paper. You said the first is the question related to the subjectivity of the historian and whether or not they can have objective knowledge of the past, or whether our knowledge of the past is ultimately a mere construction of the historian. So in other words, you're saying, can we trust our knowledge of history given the subjectivity, like the difference of opinion and experience by each author or historian, and the likelihood of human error? So how would you go about answering this? Because I feel like a lot of people wonder this, whether they admit it or not.
Yeah. This is basically the question of postmodernism and
Mm,
relativism. Are can we be honest and objective about things, or is everything just a reflection of my tribe, whatever my tribe is? So politics is really, it's too easy of an example, but if it fits in, and you'll hear people say, hey, this event is a Rorschach test for where you are politically. So if you look at this event and you interpret it this way, you're probably on this side of the political spectrum or that side. And so the question is it okay? Well, those tribes aside, like, is it true? Did these things happen? And then can I know them? And then how do we go about interpreting them? And so is it all just a our subjective element? So the two things we don't want to do, and so I said this is basically the postmodern question. Well, postmodern assumes a pre-modern, or at least a modern before it, right? Because this is
mm,
postmodern, so there's the modern before it. A lot of elements of modernity, this is like during the Enlightenment in 1900s, they were very certain in the things they knew. They didn't understand their limited perspectives, and they did. I don't want to make it, these are just generalized type statements. They did to a degree, but often took it for granted. And so postmodern was like, oh wait, no, these are just limited perspectives, and you can take postmodernism in some other different lengths, and other different perspectives. But for the sake of what we're talking about here, it has to do with whether or not, when we look at a piece of evidence, we interpret that evidence according to our wills and desires, or we reflect back what that evidence tells us. And so, since we mentioned miracles a moment ago, if we were to see a miracle right in front of us and we go, well, I don't believe miracles happen, therefore that wasn't a miracle. Okay, that's my prejudice, or my this presupposition already dictating the data, to the data, how it's going to fit in. And there's all sorts of things, like confirmation bias is maybe an example, or an outworking of it. So anyway, long story short, to answer the question, we all have subjective components to us. There's no, I mean, we're all historically situated. I'm from Fort Lauderdale. I'm not from Texas, right? So I've got different perspectives as a result of that. But that doesn't mean, however, that I cannot objectively know things. And for one very important reason, to deny that I can assumes that I can. So I cannot deny the fact that truth exists without affirming the fact that truth exists. And so it's a very famous, unaffirmable claim to say that truth does not exist, because that is a truth. And
right.
so that's a problem. So we can, that's like on the most fundamental, and I had to work through these steps through my master's and before that, because again, I really understood postmodernism in the sense of relativism, and people are selfish, and so we want to
Mm,
do things towards our favor. But despite that, we can still be objective, meaning we can still know the truth, of an event, and we can unpack some examples. I don't know if you've got some in mind, but I'll note this. This will be a good example, because I feel like, um, I don't know if I always get to talk on such, I like get so deep on subjects, even where I use the terms postmodernism, or things like that. But I refed hockey for 15 years. So I had to make judgments on calls constantly. But I also refed a lot of my friends. I refed Liberty, and I played for Liberty. Oh, there could be bias there. I like
mm,
Liberty. I enjoyed playing there. Am I going to call it fairly for them? Or am I going to give them advantages? No. And this, by the way, sports is a very common analogy in these discussions. I was just thinking Lacona uses it as well. But I've refed Liberty, and I've refed Liberty playing Virginia Tech, where I also played for the coaches with Virginia Tech. So I played with coaches on both teams. So does that mean I can't call it objectively? Even if I just played for Liberty, I can still, like, if the Liberty player goes and slashes the Virginia Tech player and I call a penalty, well, that was an objective call. I was being objectively honest, even though I might be biased towards Liberty. I wasn't, but even if I were, and I recognized that was a slash, I can be objective despite having subjective tendencies. The question that typically depends on, though, is the individual and their subjective preferences. And so some people recognize their inclinations or their presuppositions. Some people don't, but the first step is just being aware of them, because if you're not aware of them, you're more likely to abuse them. But then when you're aware of them, sometimes people go to one extreme or the other. And one extreme is, okay, I played for Liberty. I have to show that I am not biased towards them, and I'm going to call every penalty against Liberty and none on Virginia Tech. Well, wait a minute. What the crap is that? That's not fair. That's not objective. In an effort to show how objective I am, I just became super biased towards Virginia Tech. So that's not proper. But then at the same time, I can't be biased and then go, okay, well, Liberty gets to do everything. It's like, no, that's not right either. What we can do is go, okay, what's the evidence say? Well, you slashed him in the hands. Like, I saw it, and he lost the puck. And then you guys took you got a scoring opportunity the other way. It's a penalty. Oh, and they did it to you? Same thing? Or very similar? Yeah, it's a penalty too. So it's that consistent objectivity regarding whatever the event is. In this case, a hockey game with someone getting slashed. So, sorry, Ovechkin is setting records, and so, it's on my mind right now.
Yeah, hockey-minded first. That's awesome. I think that illustration is really helpful. And in your paper, you do a great job of making subjectivity a vice, or you just differentiate between a vice and a virtue. And I think that's really key. Do you mind just unpacking that a little bit? Like, how can it be used for benefit, but also caution? You might have illustrated it, but just
yeah. No, it's good. So that's what we mean when I mentioned a moment ago, it's on the individual who uses it, because sometimes for some people it becomes a vice, but other people can recognize it and use it, and it can be a virtue. So what's it mean for subjectivity to be a virtue, and what's it mean for it to be a vice? Well, only a subjective inquirer can do, like, so when we study the past, for example, that's the topic of our discussion. When we study the past, only a subjective inquirer can choose to bracket their own worldview for a moment and enter the worldview of someone else that they disagree with, or they don't understand, or it's just different, right? So if I'm studying the French Revolution, I've got, whatever my thoughts may be on it, I've got to stop, and as I'm reading it, try to understand the different writers, where they are at, what's the culture at that time, how are they understanding and interpreting these things. We'll probably get to these. In doing so, I want to make sure I'm loving my neighbor. This is a virtue, because when I do what I just mentioned there with bracketing my worldview so I can better understand what's going on in the French Revolution, then I can honestly report what was going on in the French Revolution, instead of not bracketing my worldview, assuming what I think they should be saying, and presenting them saying is what I think they should be saying. And now I'm presenting a false report because I let my biases become too paramount and dictate to the data what it should be saying. And then thirdly, I need to be humble. That's a subjective element, right? That's a virtue, to be humble or not, to follow after the data, to be willing to be wrong. And if you're wrong, just change your opinion. Now that sounds, oftentimes it sounds easy to say, but when you start dealing with experts in the field, it becomes even more and more and more difficult and more tempting, because you're like, oh no, I've studied this a long time, so I'm pretty. But we could be wrong. So understanding that is tough, and that's another element. Now the flip to that is the vices, which are, again, we don't, instead of bracketing our worldviews, we impose them. The second is we're going to bear false reports about our neighbor as a result. And then third, we're ultimately playing God, because we're defining reality how we wanted it to, right? Because we didn't get to hear their voice. We actually silenced them and imposed our own voice, and then reported that voice. And so playing God may sound a bit over dramatic, but we're recreating reality, past reality, when we do this. And there's a number of different quotes, from Rage Against the Machine to scholarly works that talk about whoever controls the past controls the future, So different elements there who do that. And there's a number of historians who see their roles as culture, as the priests of culture. So it's a very big responsibility that they perceive themselves as having. So there's a bunch of different elements there. We could give a couple good examples. This may be a good time for that are actually real examples, not just hockey examples. But I mentioned the French Revolution. For a long time, that was interpreted as through more like socialist, communist lenses. But during the fall of the USSR, there was a lot greater openness to other interpretations of the French Revolution, because now it was open to critique, whereas before it wasn't quite so open to the same critique and the same levels that it was before. Another example, this is one from Carl Trueman. He talks about Ulrich Zwingli, how he was part of the Protestant Reformation, but the Catholic Church attacked him for infidelity and for having sex outside of marriage. And so there's debate going on there. Now look, the tribes are starting to form. The Catholics, oh, look how, this guy just wants to be a Protestant so they can go live however they want to, right? Protestants, oh, you guys are just saying that because you don't like what the Protestants are saying, right? That's why you're saying it. There's no truth to that. So you see those undergirding fortresses interpreting the data. Now, yeah, it's true. The Catholic Church probably wasn't too happy with Zwingli. That doesn't make them wrong. And so a couple years go by, and a Zwingli scholar is doing research on the topic, and he finds a letter where Zwingli admitted to wrongdoing. And so you're like, oh, so there's the truth. Now we'll all know it. But no, he tries to burn the letter. Like, he's not just like, oh, let's just follow the truth, Like, yeah. His life has been, poured into this subject, and, there's going to be repercussions. And so as he puts it into the fire, though, so that's where vice is getting him, right? Because truth now in reality is going to look a lot different without that letter. Maybe Zwingli was that innocent, but again, he's recreating reality. Fortunately, he recomposed himself, or he got composure, took the letter out, preserved it, and now we know what happened. But that's a good example of how that's a subjective element there by that individual to do those sorts of things. The data was there. It can only be interpreted in so many ways, and the most clear one was evident. Otherwise, he wouldn't have tried to put it in the fire. So that's one element. And then to note, as I said before, I kind of hinted at this, if I call too many penalties on liberty or too many on Virginia Tech to show that I'm not biased, there's a phrase, and this again has to do with the subjective element. There's a phrase called oikophobia that's going around now. There's a book on it, Western Self-Contempt by Benedict Becheld. It's a good book. And it talks about how society will want to rebel against itself, I guess, maybe a good way. Oikophobia is the fear of the homeland, or the hatred of the homeland. And so some people, in an effort to show, hey, I'm not biased, I'm going to show you how not biased I am by just attacking my side viciously. That's like me calling all the penalties on liberty. Right. Okay. That's not quite right either, right? Like, so some scholars, very far, Roger Scruton coined that term, by the way, oikophobia, as far as I know. But some historians have pointed out that's a form that form of oikophobia is a prejudice, and that's not good, because now you're trying to do something that's prejudicing your results. In an effort to show you're not biased, you're becoming more biased. But then conversely, on the other side, if oikophobia is the fear of the homeland, then an ethnocentric approach is going to be one that's too dependent on it, where it just looks one way. What we're supposed to do is look at both sides and then judiciously assess them. It's not very easy to do. That's the thing. But it can be done, and there's a bunch of guys who do it and do it well. And so that's what we're looking at there when we're trying to. We can know the truth despite having subjective elements to us. And one last good example, is we might have a number of pictures of a mountain, and that doesn't mean that there's no mountain, right? So we can have objective knowledge that there is a mountain, and from different vantage points, it looks differently. But depending upon the question we're asking, not all vantage points are good vantage points, right? So if I'm behind a tree and you can just see the tip of the mountain, that's not the best mountain point. I don't have a good view on this, but someone else does. And so I can look at them and they can inform me, and then I should adjust as needed.
That's a really interesting point. That last example, because it seems to be related to the Gospels and the Gospel authors, right? Because that's where subjectivity could. And as I was reading her paper, I was thinking about this. Subjectivity, though it has serious risks, it also results in some unique benefits. It really gives you a greater insight and a desire to seek things. I have this book right here, Can We Trust the Gospels by Peter J. Williams.
Mm.
And in the very first chapter, he goes through, he answers the question, were the gospel writers biased? And he says, well, not necessarily in any way different than someone who's wrongly convicted of a crime, but he's innocent and he knows he's innocent. He's
Yeah.
biased in the sense of he knows the truth, but it's
Yeah.
not going to he's not going to stop seeking and stop looking to defend himself. So the way you just described that mountain analogy might have a lot of relevance with the gospel writers. So how do you relate this all about subjectivity to the gospel writers? Because it seems like that's where the objection stands, right? The gospel writers were biased; they're already Christians, and so forth.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's to me that's a big nothing burger. Technical term, not
It's
in
the
the
TikTok
dissertation.
objection. I'm just laying
Yeah,
them on you.
yeah, yeah. It's not because everyone's. I said that right at the gate. I think
Yeah.
everyone's biased. So I mean, are they everyone? Yeah, then they're biased. Like, but everyone's biased. So that doesn't mean anything. It's like me going, well, you can't say anything. You're a skeptic. You're biased towards skepticism. So you're
Right.
fucked. I'm done. I win. Checkmate. Right. So that doesn't do any good. And I said this before too, and I mentioned postmodernism being like the post of modernity, but there's really nothing new under the sun. I mean, in the dissertation too, I note they talk about the same issue in antiquity. Tacitus talks about it, Josephus talks about it, Lucian of Samosata talks about it, Thucydides talks about it. Like all these guys talk about it. They understand that people were tempted to only say good things about their friends and only bad things about their enemies. And the good historians would always identify the fact we got to paint the whole picture. We don't want to just give part of it. And like, there's some funny examples. I think it's of Alexander the Great. Someone I can't remember exactly the story. I believe it's in Lucian. Um, but someone writes a story about Alexander the Great defeating an army all by himself, and they're on a boat when this happens, and Alexander's reading this, and he gets ready to throw the guy overboard for writing it. He goes, "Why do you presume to fight my battles for me?" And so he got offended that this guy did
Mm.
this, and he was trying to, bluff up and pump up the emperor, which he didn't want it. But so that's the temptation, and we do all do the same thing. If you watch any Dateline, basically, the parents 9 times out of 10, their kid's innocent. If their kid's the one on trial, right?
Right.
Their friends and family, they're innocent. They didn't do it.
Mm.
Um, there are occasionally, though, those who are like, "Oh, that evidence is bad. They look like they." I love them. That's the conflict, though, right? Like, I love them. I don't want to think of them as having done something bad, but maybe they did. And conversely, oh, I'm supposed to not like that guy, but maybe he did something good, but I'm not supposed to like him. Well, maybe we're not all, as Solzhenitsyn said, we're not all wholly good or wholly evil, but the dividing line of good and evil goes between each of our hearts. Okay, that was a
Wow.
long way to answer your question on the Gospels being
No,
biased.
no, that's a great answer. And I think to summarize it all, right? It's like we have to, despite our subjectivity, humble ourselves. I love that you said that, use that word, to truth. And for some people, you have to realize there is truth, which, as you mentioned, I mean, you'll see from
Undeniable fact.
the law of
Yeah.
non-contradiction that you will find there is truth. But if we humble ourselves to truth, then the subjectivity can increase our desire and our the way we seek out truth than if we are just all like robotic to
Yeah.
information. So I think that's so good, and it goes to show. And maybe you could present some examples in the Gospels, but there's embarrassing details, right? And there's
Oh, yeah.
enemy corroboration, which is like really weighed heavily in the historical realm.
Yeah, yeah. There's a number of different elements there, and part of that is, like I said, not everyone is trying to do history.
Mm.
Some people look, temptations are a real thing, and it's okay to ask those questions. Um, I mean, look, even for believers, Paul talks about those who are just going to tickle the ears of people for their own gain. He talks about plenty of people having selfish gain back then when the church was starting. Why would we think anything's different now? but that's about. But unbelievers they're subject to the same temptation, right? It may look different.
Right.
C.S. Lewis talks about the inner ring. There's a book, The Lucifer Effect, by Philip Zimbardo, who it's basically on the famous Stanford prison experiment, where they all end up becoming just very, very. They have to stop the experiment like within just a few days. It didn't even get to the whole length of the project, but they were running a fake prison cell as part of their experiment, and it just got so out of control they had to stop it. But the point is, like, these were normal kids, but then as they got into this situation, they got more and more negative, and so they were tempted to do it, right? They weren't going in thinking, "Oh, I'm going to start calling myself John Wayne and start bullying these prisoners around." Just came about,
Right.
and so we got to be on guard. So it's not like I'm on guard before I do the study. No, it's on guard. I'm before I do it, while I do it, after I do it, and so on. So it's
Mm.
just a constant, as Paul says, examining of yourself. Um,
So good.
so that's just part of the elements, because I just think it's okay to identify temptation. Like, it's very okay to identify it, and if we're not identifying it and we're acting like it doesn't exist, that seems to me to be
Well, it's
a
another
danger.
takeaway, right, from your research is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's like, it's, yeah, sure, you could identify subjectivity in the gospel accounts in Christianity, but apply that same skepticism to all accounts in
Right.
history and science and all fields, really, because we're all human.
Yep.
And you'll come to find that you have to work through the subjectivity, not just abandon it. And I think that's
Yeah, that's a great
um,
way to put it. That's a really good way to put it. And there's a famous saying that says, just because we can never have a perfectly sterile environment for surgery doesn't mean we should
mm,
do surgery in a cesspool, right?
that's good. Yeah.
So yeah, there's that's definitely true, and that's definitely the case. But we can do things too to see if a work is objective. We can get some hints and things like you mentioned, embarrassing testimony. That's a good indicator of historicity.
Mm.
And there's a number of examples from the New Testament, like the Gospels, for example, as you mentioned. I think Peter's called Satan. I don't know. That's like, to me, that's
It's the worst.
yeah, literally the worst. Like, literally the worst.
Yeah.
And this is well after, Peter was the leading disciple in the early church for a number of years. And like, hey, don't forget to put that part in. Don't forget, like, Mark, you could come on.
Yeah.
Leave that
Oh
part out,
man.
right? Or how about Jesus's brothers, their skepticism during his lifetime?
Mm,
John could have left that out. Mark could have left that out. Like,
right.
James was the leader of the early church, and they did. But we find that throughout Scripture, not just in the New Testament, but also in the Old Testament. So we have those sorts of elements there. There's other corroborating factors too, because again, not only do they include those sorts of things, and there's other markers of history, but like, as you were kind of saying, if you've got an innocent person trying to prove their innocence, the proof they put forward, just because they're biased to show that they're right, doesn't make them false, right?
Right.
So it's the same, there's those principles are true. And so, but that also applies to people who we want to, it's just easier. It's so much easier to be like, oh, well, clearly you want that to be the case. So no.
Right.
And like, that's easy because that doesn't involve any work on my half. And that's one of the temptations of a pluralistic society. And so it seems to me anyway, that when we are confronted with the plurality of worldviews, you either say they're all right, which is kind of a postmodernism type way to go, or you say they're all wrong, which is a type of skeptical. But none of those actually involved engaging the data or
Mm,
looking at the evidence. And so when we're talking with someone, and I don't want to look stupid because we're having a discussion, well, you're just biased, and that's it. Like, because you could just wield that objection around as though it's something substantive, but I mean, no, everybody recognizes that ancient sources are biased, and even the guys writing the sources are biased. The problem that a lot of guys have in scholarship today is the fact that there's so many different portraits of Jesus that are contradictory,
mm,
and so they're like, oh, I thought as historians we're supposed to have this objective portrait, and yet here we are with a multitude of, and they call it embarrassing. It's an embarrassment to scholarship, is what John Donovan Carlson says. And so, but to me, I would expect that because I believe in things like, human sin and selfishness and all these sorts of things. So,
oh, interesting. That
yeah,
that's a good point to add to there. It shows, it's revealing, and
yeah,
that in itself is a good worldview test. So I think that's really good. So that's how you can you know the past? And I wanted to spend a little bit extra time on that because I think it's a huge question. And you really can't answer the next two questions unless you address that one first, right? So,
Yeah, yeah.
can you know the past? Yes, despite subjectivity. What about how do we know the past? And I think this is a great question to ponder on. You propose that there's two tools available. Do you want to just unpack those for us here?
Yeah,
What are the
yeah.
tools that we can
I just
use?
and I just present two tools. They're not; these aren't the only tools. I just think, to me, they're just the most fundamental. Um,
Mm,
because again, I'm coming from that. Okay, I just need to have the most basic facts. How do we know even just not anything, but how do we get the core data that we can accept? Because some interpretations, as you know, in science, for example, it gets pretty deep and pretty nitty gritty. Okay, but before I get to the nitty gritty, where do I start even before that?
right.
And so the two are, and they're somewhat related, but the first one is the use of historical criteria. And what's really neat is since my dissertation came out, there's another dissertation that's got published. I think it was with Brill on the use of historical criteria by other ancient historians in other fields. They just use a different name for it, but they're doing the same task, and then with those in the New Testament field as well. But they're looking at things like you said, embarrassing testimony. Is there enemy testimony? How many sources do we have that report an event? Because usually in antiquity, we only have one source. And I think it's John Meyer who says if we've got two sources, it's virtually indisputable that the event happened.
Hmm,
And so, like for some events we have regarding Jesus's life, there's over a dozen sources that report it happening. Um, and these are all things that, by the way, these are all very intuitive. We do this all the time. Like,
right.
not all testimonies created equal, right? Like, if my mom says I'm the best, okay, Michelle, we take that with a grain of salt, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Look, she's not wrong, okay? Just,
He's a black belt.
um, but yeah, so we take those things with a grain of salt. But if it's like, my arch nemesis is like, oh,
Mm,
yeah, he's good. We got to be ready. Like, okay, now it's like, okay, there's more weight to that.
right.
But so we all recognize these sorts of things, and so I think when we look at how do we study, I use this example a lot because when I was getting my degree, I was in insurance full time. That was my day job as an adjuster. So I go look at damage and house, cars, whatever. Um, and so but detectives will come on the scene and try to figure out what happened. And what do? They try to talk to the witnesses. They weigh the evidence between the witnesses, and try to see which lines up better with the data that they have. And so we can do some things very similar to that today. Um, these criteria don't take away from the historicity of an event. So, for example, I mentioned if you've got one source or like a dozen sources, um, if I've got a dozen, each of those is like a pebble added to historicity. If I only have one pebble, that still adds to historicity. It doesn't to take away, for example, um, if I only have one source. It's not a mark against it.
Right.
So it's not like, oh, it's unhistorical because only one source said it. That's not how the criteria work. There's one exception to that, and that's context. And this is the easiest example. If you see the disciples riding around on motorcycles, you know right away, like that. Okay, this did not happen. That's a
Yeah.
mark against the historicity there. It's clearly not in the context. So you have that's one of the tools you can use as a mark against historicity. But the others, they do add to it. And so scholars weigh them and a bunch of other things. And then we want to look at which explanations have the best, make the best sense, the inference to the best explanation. So that's one. And I think that's the most intuitive. Most of us do that kind of stuff already. We just don't know, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Oh, when did they, like, I got on a deep dive the other day on mentalism. Been watching O's do some stuff lately. It's just awesome. And I picked up card tricks during COVID. Different story. But I picked up Darren Brown's book, and he's a very famous European mentalist. I didn't pick it up. It was on archive.org, so I was just trying to see if
Right.
I could find anything on there. And his book, I was like, oh, he's good, so let me pick up. His first sentence is, the Bible is not history. And I'm like, wasn't expecting to go down this road, but let's
Yeah.
see where it goes. And I read a couple pages, and then he ends up saying, the New Testament was written centuries later. I was like, how does he think that? Like, what it's written in 2007. Like, it's not that old.
Right.
But that's just so, like, Bart Ehrman dates everything within the first century. So how does an atheist agnostic date everything? Like, he puts John's gospel at 90-95 AD as the last gospel. How is where is Brown getting the centuries later? So yeah, anyway, you have all those sorts of things, and you have to weigh them. But most of us, we don't know who Corinth is, to go back to that, or when were
Right.
they written, and things like that. So as you start understanding, that's part of the research you got to do too. The second, um, the second way is the minimal facts approach, and this is really just a common ground approach. And it says it only looks at data or facts that are very, very highly evidenced using multiple lines of critical historical argumentation. That can include the criteria that we talked about, but it can include beyond that. Archaeological, you can add those elements too. Other logical type arguments too. But the second criterion of it is that it's widely accepted by virtually all scholars of different backgrounds. So it's not an idiosyncratic belief of just this liberty school. It's broader than that. And this approach has been applied to other components of history, like the founding of America, for example, some of the early American history. There's a couple books that have done that very same approach. But we've also seen common ground approaches elsewhere. Actually, in the appendix, I list a number of guys who start with widely accepted facts to start as a starting point. So those are some areas. And we could just use the French Revolution, for example. We might say, yeah, we know there was a revolution. There was great political turmoil. What exactly the causes were, we can start, narrowing those down, and some get more weight than others. But okay, but then that's a different discussion. Then did it happen? Same thing with car accident. Okay, we know a red car hit a blue car. Okay, whose fault? Well, okay, well, I don't know all the details, but everyone agrees an accident happened and it was a red car and a blue car involved. So
Hmm.
those are the even subjectivities are kind of accounted for in a greater sense with that kind of an approach.
It's so good. Yeah. And so I love the MFA, the minimal facts approach, because it boils down the evidence, right? And I was just teaching, as I told you before this recording, on the resurrection, and we used Gary Habermas's minimal facts argument. And I've told the students it's kind of like a set of filters, because you have all these explanations for the resurrection, but if you just take them by themselves, what are you measuring them against? Like, what's your standard of truth? And the minimal facts approach, at least to me, seems like they're filters that you could put each explanation through and
Mm.
see how they fit. And
Right.
given that it's accepted by scholars of various beliefs, like you mentioned, that's huge. So it's not just biased in the subjective sense, it's really sought out and established. What would be, and I know this could be a whole episode in of itself, but what would be just like three minimal facts for the resurrection that you usually just posit right off the bat?
Ah, that's a good one. I'm gonna come. I'll do three, but it's really gonna be four.
There you
So
go.
I'm
Okay,
gonna
that's
cheat.
fine.
Yeah, very typical movie. I'm gonna cheat.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, the first one is Jesus's death. Like this is the other good thing about the minimal facts. Everybody already knows the minimal facts. They just don't know that they're minimal facts. Like they don't know that they're highly evidenced and that they're widely accepted. So I don't think any of your listeners are going to be surprised to learn that Jesus died on the cross. That's not a new fact for any of them. So but that's a minimal fact because it's
Mhm.
highly evidenced. It has over at least a dozen sources that attest to it. Not to mention the fact that it's reported early, it's highly embarrassing, a whole bunch of other factors. Um, but so that's one. The second is that it's proclaimed early in the sense that we have very early evidence of appearances too. So I'm kind of combining. It was proclaimed early, but what was proclaimed early was the fact that multiple people saw the risen Jesus. And again, this is a widely accepted argument that the earliest evidence we have for the resurrection is from 1 Corinthians 15. And Paul says that Jesus died. He says Christ died for our sins, which is important for our sins. This is a summary of the gospel of first importance that has the power to save. Christ died for our sins according to the scripture, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and the 12 and to the 500, most of whom are alive, but some have fallen asleep. Then to James, then to all the apostles, and then last of all, he appears to Paul. So in that brief report, that's just verses 3 to 8, you have appearances to Peter, Paul, and James, the 12, 500, and all the apostles, 3 groups, 3 individuals. And scholars date this information to the early 30s AD because in Galatians 1:18, Paul says 3 years after his conversion, he went up to Jerusalem and met with Peter and James, the 2 other individuals named in the information in 1 Corinthians 15. So it's widely accepted. Bart Ehrman says that meeting in Galatians 1:18 is probably the place where Paul received all the traditions that he gives us in the New Testament, because that information in 1 Corinthians 15 is considered to be an oral tradition preserved in writing. We could just call it a creed. And there's a number of creeds in the New Testament. Philippians 2:5-11, Romans 10:9 is another example. Those are both very high Christological creeds. I mean, Ehrman says, yeah, he probably got him here just 3 years after Paul converted, and so that puts this information to the early 30s AD. So that's really good. And again, it's a widely accepted argument. It's virtually unanimous among scholars. And then the other one would be Paul's conversion. I don't think that's new to anybody here, but it's widely accepted historical fact. Paul creates a problem for a number of alternative theories. Like I do something kind of like what you're getting at, but like I'll ask questions, I'll present the minimal facts, and then I'll ask alternative theories and ask the people listening. You respond to it. Apply the facts that you know. Don't just listen to them, but now you got to apply them. So it's like showing a jiu-jitsu move, and like, okay, now you got to try. Like, whoa, what do you mean I got to try? But that the disciples stole the body, Paul probably thought that, given his connection, as a Pharisee and all. So that's not going to explain his conversion. So that's already a challenge. But trying to get people to think like, okay, not just in Bible story, like not just something I read in my Bible, but these are actual events that happen. And if you're going to say that, something here, well, it doesn't fit with the data we have. And so anyway, I think those are the 3 I would like. I don't know if Habermas would pick the same. He might.
Yeah, it's so good. I personally, I love the empty tomb, and I just find it to be such a stumbling block to these alternative theories. But like the minimal facts to me, like you said, it's filters, right? It's like you have to, and I said this to the students, like possibility does not equal probability.
Oh
But
yeah,
for you to
100%.
measure probability, you need something to measure it against, or you're kind of just flying blind. So the minimal facts approach, when I came across it, it was probably from Habermas. I was just like blown away, and this really helped me come to seek the truth of the resurrection. But there is always that last problem, and probably the most prominent, and it's that last question you offer is, can historians investigate divine action?
Yeah.
So the issue with miracles. And so I know we only have about 7 minutes or so before the end of the hour. So if you could stay on a bit longer, I appreciate that. If
Yeah.
not,
We're
we
good.
can.
We're good.
Okay,
We're talking.
cool.
This is one of my favorite subjects. This next one.
Awesome. I want to be respectful of your time, but
You're good.
I also don't want to rush through miracles because this is such a big thing. So how would you, one, define a miracle, and then how would you just unpack this, how we can investigate one?
Yeah, and even before I answer this, you said something that needs to be repeated. Possibility is not probability. We can speculate any creative theory that's not logically contradictory, and it's logically possible. That doesn't mean it's probable. So, Descartes' evil demon theory, well, that's a possible explanation for all our past historical events, right? It's possible, but I think we're well within our rights not to believe that, right? So we have, just because someone posits something, and you'll see this a lot too, someone will go, if this happens, if, and they said if and may and could, and they used all those qualifiers, and then at the end, so this did happen. You're like, wait, it was if. Now you're saying it's on the same ground as the one that we know. So excellent point there. Historians of miracles. So I take a minority position that historians can say a miracle happened. I think it seems obvious that a historian can, because historians are supposed to identify and discuss what happened in the past. And if a miracle happened in the past, guess who should be talking about it? Historians.
Right.
And you'll hear some objections. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to see if I can pull up my definition, because it is more thoughtful than I'd be able to put on the spot. But it was very strategic, I believe, when I was setting it up.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people will define a miracle in such a way that it could never happen. For example, a miracle by definition is the most improbable event. That's
Hmm.
that's what some people have put forward, and I don't think that's a good definition, because you've defined it as an impossibility before you've even started. So
They need to answer our first question about subjectivity before they
yeah, I
move
think
on.
there's an element there. I can't find it quick enough, but that's okay. Yeah, I can't find it quick enough. But um, to me, I'll just give you my general broad strokes. A miracle is just an event where God was an agent for the event, whatever the event
Hmm.
was. But before even getting into this, I'm going to unpack that a little bit more in a moment. There's David Hume's the quintessential reason why a lot of people don't take miracles seriously. I think Hume's on the way out for a lot of different reasons.
Hmm.
I think there's a greater openness now to miracles than there has been. I got a book back there that says even atheists believe in miracles. So,
Well, they have to believe in at least one of them.
that's right. The Miracle Myth by Larry Shapiro. He talks.
Hmm.
So he's arguing against miracles, but he's like, look, majority of us even think they happen, so we got a problem. Uh, and so one of the so anyway, Hume's kind of on the way out, in my opinion. And so is this. Hey, I'm gonna stay focused here, Shaw. All right. So in the discussions, you'll often hear this distinction made between the natural and the supernatural. And if you've seen the movie Speed, where they're talking, what do you do if there's a hostage and you shoot the hostage? This is that kind of moment, because I don't like those distinctions at all, and I think they need to be done away with. I'm not the only one, because how do you define? Where's the dividing line between the supernatural and the natural? And I don't think it's when we start asking that question, it's hard to identify where it is, especially when you start talking about things like near-death experiences.
Right.
If we have evidential near-death experiences, and I think we do, is that natural or is that supernatural? I've got no idea. So all I can do is just pose that question to people who take that distinction.
Hmm.
So rather than having this bifurcated reality, I just say it's just all reality. I don't know if it's supernatural or natural. It's just what it is.
Right.
And so there's a number of good philosophical arguments that raise that same question. I think the gentleman's name is Stephen Clark from Oxford. So, at least I got, somewhat good company, right?
Right.
But yeah, so I think that's one of the challenges. So then the question is, okay, well, what is history doing? History is looking at past events, like we said, and it's discussing how agents like Paul, Peter, like, what did they do? But people are just agents. And this is another distinction we want to make. When we're looking at causal events and there was a fire that started, you could say, well, fires happen when heat and oxygen and a material meet. Right. That's a scientific type explanation. Or you could say, but Bob took a match and lit the fire. So those are two valid explanations of how the fire started. But one of them involves agent explanation, which is Bob started the fire. And that's what historians are doing. They're looking at agents and how they acted in history, and they're explaining that and unpacking that in all sorts of different ways. When it comes to God's an agent. He's a person that has the ability to act and does act. And all you need, again, even if you don't hold all those things necessarily, um, the possibility is there. And if the possibility is there, then you have to be willing to acknowledge that, okay, well, a historian can say a miracle acts if God does so, in fact, act in the world. And there are some guys that do that. I think Gregory Dawes is one of them. There's a couple others. So that's an important distinction, because we talk about other agents, not just, there's plenty of histories on different, like dogs or horses or other animals, like reflecting agent action. And there's histories on military dogs, for example, or military horses, and they're discussing how they train them or whatever the case may be. So if we look at agents in the past, and he's a super agent, but he's still an agent, right? We can identify his acts if he acts in history. And so I think that seems to me to be reasonable. Now, the question, that doesn't make it easy. I'm not saying that makes it easy, but that
Right.
certainly opens, okay, it's possible then. But then some guys will object and go, well, look, we're just historians. We don't have the philosophical or theological tools to do this kind of stuff. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. So who? I get confused because I see historians talking about economics, but they're not economists. I see
Mm,
historians talking about politics, but they're not political theorists. I see them talking about war, but I don't see them. I don't know if they have a degree in military tactics or anything like that. So they cross discipline all the time.
right.
They'll talk about near death experiences and bereavement visions. And you're not a psychologist. How are you able to talk about these things? So I think I do not find that to be a persuasive objection at all. And I think we all have uh, these abilities. Like you have capabilities to make these discussions. And if we're talking about who knows the past events, I think a historian is in the best position because they should have the data better than most people. So
Right.
that's kind of the overview answer I have there.
It's really good, and it's like there's you to raise this question or this problem and say like, oh well, historians cannot look into miracle claims. They don't have the ability to do that. Is ruling out miracles as being possible to
Oh yeah,
begin with, and it's super circular, but also it's. I think Tim Barnett at Stand to Reason. I heard this from him. He gave an illustration, and he said, imagine there's a murder, and the sheriff is there, and there's a bunch of detectives, and the sheriff goes to the detectives and say, you need to urgently look for the murderer, look for him with all urgency, but if he's over 6 feet tall, do not consider him as a
yeah,
as someone who did it. And the first question you're going to ask is like, what if he's over 6 feet tall? And that's kind of what it seems like we're doing when we look at past events and we say, oh well, it definitely can't be that. It can't be
yeah,
a miracle.
yeah. I think that's that presupposition thing that we talked about at the very gate. You've already refused to bracket your worldview for a moment.
Right.
At the very least, I think that's an element of it. The other is, I think the fear of, well, we can't have a perfectly sterile environment, so let's do it in a cesspool comes up because some other objections you'll hear is, oh, well, if they find the guy under 6 feet tall, he's just going to say a demon did it and we have to believe him. And I'm like,
Mm.
no, I didn't say you have to accept every claim uncritically. That's not my argument. That's not the
Right.
argument I'm presenting. We can assess it, right? And so that's perfectly, and we're not saying God of the gaps. Like we're not saying because I can't explain it, therefore God. No, I'm saying there's inferences to lead me to think about God being the cause here. For example, like in Mark 2 is a great example where Jesus heals the paralytic. But Jesus heals the paralytic after he says your sins are forgiven. But we can't see sins being forgiven. I can't. I mean, maybe some of your viewers got something I don't, like, but Jesus knows this. And so
Right.
he does the miracle so that will confirm what he just said to demonstrate that his sins were forgiven, this thing we can't see. And we do that with other things, by the way, like love, for example. You can't like see love, but we see it in action, right? So
Mhm.
that may be another type of example there where we infer the things from our surroundings. And then so that's kind of two other semi-related objections. And then the third is a very bad misunderstanding of the word faith, where it seems like it wants to be couched as blind faith. Like, oh, that's not a question for the historian, that's a question of faith.
Yeah.
I don't even know I really don't know what that means. I'm not trying to be
Yeah.
smart, but I'm like, when I went to Liberty, I would hear phrases that I'd never heard before. And I'm like, I don't know what that means. But I feel the same way when I hear these punts to what appear to be a definition of blind faith, because I don't know what they mean by that. I think the term blind faith itself seems like an oxymoron.
Yeah.
But faith, as I understand it in the Bible, it has to do with faithfulness. It's not just an empty thing. You have to know what to put your faith into. And so uh, there's a good book, um, Salvation by Allegiance Alone. Part of that
Mm.
definition of faith is you're giving your allegiance to someone. But I've got to know something about the someone who I'm giving my allegiance to and what it looks like to give them allegiance. And so you can't have faith without knowledge, and you can't have knowledge without faith, without zeal. Sorry. Like there's a passion, right? A will, a desire of the will, but also the head knowledge that goes with it. And I use this example all the time. My wife, I married a girl from Alabama, so I learned about SEC football. She's an Auburn fan. Auburn is a huge rival with Alabama. If I buy her an Alabama jersey because I love her and I just have this zeal without knowledge, she's going to punch me in the nose, right? Like, what are you doing? I don't know her. So I can't, like, the two are needed. You have to have the will to buy the gift, but I have to have the knowledge to know what the gift should look like. So to me, I've always just found those, it just seems, I don't know, it just seems so strange because it's not a faithful thing. Like, it's not just this blind thing that came out of nowhere. They're like, oh, what's a good way we can justify our sins being forgiven? Oh, resurrection. Okay, great. No one can test this. Don't worry about that body in the tomb anymore. Or, whatever, So it's just a very strange concept to me, and part of that's probably because I didn't, um, my background's different, so I'm just coming from an outside to a lot of these discussions. Uh, not to a lot of them, but to just this understanding of faith, which is so different to me, anyway.
Well, it's a lot of people in the church have taken on that definition of faith, right? And they look at, oh, I like when they go to pastors with doubt. I've had so many people tell me that their pastors just told them have more faith. But again, it's like what are you defining faith as? Is it just like blindly going about, or is it trusting in something substantial? And I think, and you would agree, and others as well, like we have substantial reasons for trusting in God, one that he exists and another that he's good and all powerful and loving. And the resurrection is just another reason we're trusting in the one who can, and the one who did. And so I think to sum up our whole conversation, really the three questions, right? Can we know the past? Yes. How do we know the past? The minimal facts approach, historical criteria, and so forth. It really just being honest to the evidence. And then the last one, can we investigate divine action? It seems to me, and this might be a weird answer, I would say no if you're closed off to the possibility to begin with, right? It's almost like you have to first come to that humility that
Yeah.
it's possible, or else, sure, you're going to make up a million explanations for what very well will be a miracle.
Yeah, and you don't want to do that.
Right.
And by the way, I meant to note this earlier. It's not, if people do it in other fields, we should expect to find it when we're talking about Jesus. We see it in science too.
Yeah.
Thomas Kuhn's famous book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he discusses how one scientist will call another scientist not a scientist because he's coming to a different conclusion because their paradigms, the phrase he uses, are different. And so they're interpreting the evidence so differently. But that's how scientific revolutions come and new discoveries come because people are open to the evidence and they analyze it differently. But if we close off the door of possibilities, then we're closing off in science the door to future discoveries. And this is one of the common critique of we can't tell miracles happen because you're closing off doors of possibility before you even begin an investigation. And we don't do that.
Right.
Why are we just doing that here when it comes to miracles? I get you're afraid, not in a bad way, concerned about, someone, all these appeals to gods of the gaps, and that's fine. Just critique them. Like, that's the answer. Right? So I'm concerned about people lying every day, right? You got to address it. You call it, whatever it is. So again, and this goes back to the point you said, just because it can't be perfectly done doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it, or
Right.
it can't be done.
Should honestly seek the evidence. And I think
Yeah.
that's like this whole conversation to me, if I'm a skeptic and I'm listening, I'm thinking, okay, that's so what you're telling me, you didn't give me reason to trust in the resurrection. And I would say, no, that wasn't the goal. The goal
Right.
is to put down your blinders and to seriously consider the resurrection and that's what I'm seeing. I think I could give the best, at least what I think is the best reasons and minimal facts and arguments and scriptural verses. But if the person is just tuned out and from the jump saying not possible, can't happen, it's not worth having a conversation. But as we both know, the implication of believing or not believing in the resurrection does have serious eternal implications. So,
Yeah, even Darren Brown, he goes, look, it's the crux of Christianity. If it's true, it's all true, and regardless what you think about Christians, it's true. But yeah, there's a lot there with what you said too, because I like the minimal facts because it presents the data, and sometimes as we discuss the data, those presuppositions or those blind spots that people may have, they don't know until someone points them out to them. I've had a bunch of those, and people point them out to me, and I'm like, oh, I got to change my view, and I got to
right.
change my perspective on things. So sometimes that's the point of the discussion we may be having with someone, and the facts get us to that point because they bring those things to the surface, which normally they're they're in the their presuppositions. But then we also understand Matthew 11 is such a good chapter because John the Baptist has questions about Jesus, and he came preparing the way for the Lord. And if he's got questions, it's okay if we have questions. And Jesus gives him some evidence that his disciples were aware of. So, and then he says some nice things about John. But then in the same chapter, a few verses later, he talks about how some people they don't care about evidence whatsoever. And he said, John came neither eating nor drinking, and you said he's crazy. I came eating and drinking, you said I was a glutton. No matter what we did, you guys already had your view made up. So no evidence was going to satisfy you. And so I think those things become manifest in the sense that we just see it, right? Because again, it brings it to the surface. And then you can press them. And the same thing for me. I've had questions on different views I've had, and I've kind of changed and modified different things over the years. I'm sure I'll keep doing it, but you have these. I think those are the discussions that help, and as long as you're willing to modify them or adapt them as needed, according to the evidence, not just for the sake of fitting in with a group, not just for the sake of rebelling against your culture, whatever. Because at the end of the day, it's between you and God, and that's the most fundamental thing. But Paul Copan just had a brilliant article, very short article. It's in the Worldview Bulletin, and it's called "The Resurrection: Good News for an Anxious World." And so he does a great job of highlighting a number of different elements, how these all tie together.
So good. And I think one of the biggest takeaways, right, is for our listeners is, are you seeking truth or are you seeking affirmation? And I think when I read your dissertation, that's what I get out of it is, am I seeking truth openly or am I just seeking to affirm what I already believe? And yeah, you're going to walk away believing the same exact thing if that's your attitude, or you might have to, like you said, change your beliefs, which takes humility, but if it's worth it if you're seeking truth at the end of the day.
Yeah, and there could be some things you're seeking the truth on, and you think you're right on, and guess what? You're going to be right. Right? So,
Right.
even a broken clock, right? So so it's just being genuine and being honest about it. And then when you're confronted with that letter with Zwingli, what are you going to do? Do you burn it or do you keep it?
So good. Well, Dr. Shaw, it's been great having you on just to walk us through that dissertation and the amazing work that you're doing. What is the website? Is it coreapologetics.com or is it a different URL? Coreapologetics.com. And listeners, check out On the Resurrection. I think the volume 1 and 2 are out now. I think 3 is available for pre-order and 4 not yet, if I'm not mistaken.
Or it should be out in the fall. Volume 3 in total has somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 footnotes.
Wow. It's unbelievable. But yeah, check out Core Apologetics. Ben, thank you again for jumping on. And to our listeners, tune in next time. God bless.